Good evening. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is once again counting down to the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket with the last batch of the version 1.5 Starlink satellites. Liftoff tonight is scheduled for 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 3:50 UTC for our viewers around the world. Should they need it, SpaceX has a backup launch opportunity tomorrow night at 11:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 3:24 UTC. This will be the second launch attempt for this particular mission, the Starlink 5-15 mission. We were here on Thursday night, Friday morning for the first launch attempt. The countdown appeared to go smoothly until we reached the T-minus 40-second point, at which point the countdown was halted. SpaceX has not disclosed the reason for that hold in the countdown, which scrubbed the launch. It did initially retarget the launch for early on Saturday morning, but instead decided to do a static test fire of the Falcon 9 rocket, which took place overnight at 12:50 p.m. a.m. And if you stay tuned, we'll have a replay of that static fire. Although SpaceX did announce they'd be performing the static fire, they did not tell us what the outcome of that test was, but we're assuming that all went well, as SpaceX appears to be counting down for another launch attempt tonight. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like button on our stream. That really helps us out. This will be the second time this week that SpaceX has pushed the envelope by flying a Falcon 9 rocket for a 16th time. It was just last Sunday that booster 1058 flew for that record-breaking 16th time. Tonight, it is the turn of booster tail number 1060 to launch on its 16th mission. Previously, SpaceX had certified its fleet of Falcon 9 boosters for up to 15 flights. I'm Stephen Young, and I'll be providing commentary from Spaceflight Now's News Bureau at the Kennedy Space Center press site. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues Will Robinson-Smith, who's running our social media feeds tonight, and Adam Bernstein, who will be operating the cameras. If you'd like to support our coverage of the space program, you can use the YouTube Super Chat feature. You can also subscribe so you get notifications when we go live. And you can become a member and get access to member-only videos and discounts at our online shop. We can't do these broadcasts without the support of our members and viewers, and we'd like to thank everyone who's made a contribution to help fund our coverage. Thank you to Laura Arul for her support in the Super Chat. Once again, we appreciate anyone's support, whether it's just a click of the like button or a donation through the Super Chat. It really helps us expand and improve our coverage. So coming up next, the launch director will open their go, no-go poll. This is an electronic poll that takes place with the click of a mouse button. Each member of the launch team gives their go or no-go for the proceeding of the countdown and the start of propellant load. The countdown is being run from the Launch and Landing Control Center, which is just outside the south gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. There are also teams at SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California, who are also supporting the launch from control rooms there. By this point, the chief engineer should have already conducted a technical poll of their team. As is pretty much.
Attention launch operators. Propellant load and go no poll is open.
And there we have the launch director announcing that that poll is now open. As is typical at this time of year, we've had some afternoon thunderstorms in the area that have lingered into the evening. Those storms have pretty much avoided the launch pad area, passing north and south of the spaceport. The last weather forecast we saw from the 45th Weather Squadron at Patrick Space Force Base gave an 85% chance of acceptable conditions for launch tonight. And once again, the main concerns are with weather rules associated with lightning, the anvil cloud rule and the cumulus cloud rule. The 45th Weather Squadron said it was not expecting any problems with upper level wind conditions or with the recovery conditions out to sea where the first stage booster will land on a drone ship. And as we said before, if there was a weather problem tonight or another technical issue, SpaceX does have a backup opportunity tomorrow at 11:24 p.m. Eastern Time. And during that launch opportunity, there also is an 85% chance of acceptable weather for launch. So as I mentioned earlier, we were here on Thursday night, Friday morning for the first launch attempt of Starlink 5-15. And the countdown was stopped at the T-minus 42nd point. SpaceX did not disclose the reason for that hold. They did tentatively reschedule the launch for Friday night, Saturday morning, but then decided instead to do a static test fire of the Falcon 9 on the launch pad to verify that all systems would be ready for another launch attempt. We have a replay of that static test fire, and I'll show you that now. Shortly you'll see the ignition. There's the green flash of the T-tab igniter fluid, and then the Merlin engines, the 9 Merlin engines at the base of the Falcon 9 fired for roughly 10 seconds or so. That was earlier this morning at 12:50 a.m. SpaceX did not give us an update on the outcome of that test, but we're assuming that all went well as they are proceeding with tonight's countdown. So as I mentioned earlier, this booster 1060, is making its 16th flight. It will be the second Falcon 9 first stage in the SpaceX fleet to reach that milestone. The first was booster 1058, which launched last Sunday, carrying 22 second-generation Starlink satellites into orbit. That booster returned to Port Canaveral this week, and our photographer and videographer Adam Bernstein captured this video of the booster as it was being offloaded from the drone ship. And as you can see, it is quite sooty. Its 16 flights have coated it in a layer of soot. You can barely make out the SpaceX logo on the side of the rocket. And this booster will also be making a 16th flight tonight if all goes according to plan.
Readiness pull is in the go for propellant loading.
And we just heard the launch director give his go for propellant loading.
Launch director with abort instruction. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the C or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold, hold, hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
So there we have the launch director's confirmation that the team has polled go for the start of propellant load tonight. That operation will begin at T-minus 35 minutes. Let's take a look at the countdown there. A little earlier than on the timeline. The launch director verification usually comes by T-minus 38 minutes, but we've already had that confirmation. So the start of propellant load will begin at T-minus 35 minutes. That process begins with the loading of RP1, that's rocket-grade kerosene, aboard the first and second stages of the rocket. And at the same time, the launch team will also begin loading liquid oxygen aboard the first stage of the rocket. That's a densified liquid oxygen that is super chilled and allows SpaceX to pack a lot more propellant into the rocket than if it were using the regular liquid oxygen that most rockets launched from Cape Canaveral use. So then as the countdown proceeds, the next major visual milestone will be the start of the so-called big vent, where we see a large plume of vapor come from the strongback structure that sits alongside the rocket at the launch pad. That is a process that cools and purges the plumbing that runs up that strongback to the second stage. That is all in preparation for the start of loading of liquid oxygen aboard the upper stage of the vehicle, and that begins at T-minus 16 minutes. The Falcon 9 will begin a process known as engine chill at T-minus 7 minutes. That's when a small amount of liquid oxygen is fed into the engines through the plumbing and the turbo pumps to cool down those engines and their systems so that during the ignition sequence there is not a thermal shock when that super cold propellant flows through for the start of the engine ignition. Then at 4.5 minutes before launch, the strung back structure, the transporter erector that has stood alongside the rocket at the pad and was used earlier this week to raise the rocket into the vertical position, that will retract from the vehicle. It reclines to an angle of about 1.5 degrees and will stay there until liftoff. And at liftoff, hydraulics will pull it back in a more rapid fashion so that the Falcon 9 can safely clear the launch pad as it lifts off. At about 2 minutes, the loading of propellants should be complete. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of propellants. Then in the final 60 seconds of the countdown, control will be handed over from the ground sequencer to the Falcon 9's onboard computers. The propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. The SpaceX launch director will give their final go for liftoff. And then the engine ignition command will be issued at...
Tanks are venting for the start of propellant load.
And there we hear one of the first steps in the start of the loading of propellants. So at ignition, the flight computers will check that the 9 Merlin engines at the base of the Falcon 9 are running properly, and then clamps will be released, and the Falcon 9 will lift off at T0. And propellant loading should now be underway.
The launch auto sequence has started.
And there we heard confirmation from the launch team that the process of loading propellants aboard the Falcon 9 is getting underway. At this point, liquid oxygen will be loaded aboard the first stage of the vehicle, and kerosene, rocket-grade kerosene known as RP1, Rocket Propellant 1, is being loaded aboard both the first stage and the second stage. So let's take a closer look at the Falcon 9 vehicle. So it stands 70 meters tall on the launch pad. That's about 229 feet. And it has a diameter of 3.6 meters or 12 feet. The first stage is the bottom 2/3 of the vehicle. Today's booster has flown 15 times before and is designated tail number 1060 in the SpaceX fleet. At the base of the rocket are the 9 Merlin engines, which burn rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen to produce 1.7 million pounds of thrust. At the bottom of the rocket, around the engine compartment, are the black carbon fiber landing legs that will be used about 8.5 minutes into the flight when the Falcon 9 lands on the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. Above the first stage is the interstage. This is a composite structure. It consists of an aluminum honeycomb core surrounded by carbon fiber. In the inset image on the right of the screen, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and steering when the Falcon 9 is descending through the atmosphere before it lands on the drone ship. At the top of the interstage are the 3 mechanical latches that attach the interstage to the second stage. When the first stage engines cut off, high-pressure helium is used to open those latches, and pneumatic pushers are used to ensure there is a clean separation between the first and second stage. The second stage nozzle is housed inside that interstage adapter. The upper stage is powered by a single Merlin engine. It's modified to work in a vacuum and is known as the MVAC engine. It's equipped with a much larger nozzle than the Merlin engines on the first stage and produces about 200,000 pounds of thrust. It will be fired twice on today's flight to place the 54 Starlink satellites into their intended orbit. Like the first stage, it uses the same propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen. That stage will ignite for a third time after the deployment of the Starlink satellites, and that is for a deorbit burn to drive the upper stage back into the atmosphere where it will burn up. And this is done to eliminate the risk of creating any space debris. At the very top of the rocket is the payload fairing. This is made up of carbon composite materials and is 13 meters in diameter, 30 meters tall, and that's about 43 feet, and 5.2 meters in diameter, or 17 feet. Inside the fairing are the 54 Starlink satellites that are being launched on this mission. And as you can see, we've now got a visual confirmation that the loading of liquid oxygen and kerosene is underway. Those super cold propellants, the liquid oxygen in particular, chill the outer structure of the Falcon 9, and when that comes into contact with the hot and humid Florida air, the water vapor condenses out, and we see that in the form of the wisps that are wrapping themselves around the core of the Falcon 9 rocket out at Launch Pad 40. This mission is designated Starlink 5-15, and it's going to launch the last 54 of the older generation Starlink satellites, which are known as the version 1.5 satellites. Earlier this year, SpaceX started launching a new generation of Starlink satellites, and those are known as the Starlink V2 minis. They are much larger than the Starlinks that are being launched tonight, and have 4 times the capacity of these older generation satellites. Here's a look at what those satellites look like inside the fairing of the Falcon 9. This is actually a file photo from a previous Starlink mission. The Starlink satellites are stacked up on top of the payload adapter, and then are enclosed within the fairing. You can see one half of the fairing in this photo being moved into position around those satellites. And there are 54 Starlink satellites on this mission. The number of satellites launched varies by 1 or 2 occasionally, but the second generation Starlink satellites, because they're much larger, each Falcon 9 can only launch about 22 of those larger satellites. But on this mission, there are 54 of the Starlink satellites, which weigh about 660 pounds or 300 kilograms. They are equipped with solar panels, which power an ion propulsion system that enables them to maneuver in orbit. They were built by SpaceX at a facility in Redmond, Washington. And their operational orbit will be about 329 miles or 530 kilometers high. And these particular satellites will be going into an orbit with an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. This is what a Starlink receiving antenna looks like, mounted on the outside of a building. SpaceX has, through its Starlink division, has released multiple versions of the ground antenna now, so that it can be used on aircraft and ocean-going vessels, and even a flat antenna that can be mounted on the top of an RV or other vehicle that can be used in motion. And here's a comparison of what the version 1.5 Starlink satellites look like compared with the version 2 minis. And they use a slightly different deployment mechanism as well. The satellites on tonight's mission are held down by retention rods that are released and that drift off into space, whereas the version 2 minis, the retention rods are hinged and remain attached to the second stage after they release the satellites. The Starlink network provides broadband services to customers around the world. Back in May, SpaceX announced that the Starlink service had 1.5 million subscribers. In the last few minutes, in addition to loading propellants, cryogenic helium is being pumped aboard the vehicle to provide pressure for the fuel tanks after launch. The loading of kerosene aboard the upper stage should be nearing completion. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up button. That really helps us out and brings us a bigger audience for our launch coverage. We want to make sure that as many people as possible get to see this launch tonight.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
And with the start of the big vent, we also heard the launch control team announce that the loading of kerosene aboard the second stage is complete. So that's the first propellant tank now full on the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen and kerosene continues to be loaded aboard the first stage. And what we're seeing, this so-called big vent out of the launch pad, this stream of vapor that's being emitted from the strongback structure, that is the process of chilling down and purging the plumbing in the strongback that feeds liquid oxygen into the upper stage of the rocket. You can, those of you who were here for the first launch attempt will notice there's maybe a little more breeze tonight. That stream is extending out a lot further on the first launch attempt with very little movement in the air. It was just settling around the base of the rocket, creating quite an eerie view. We're at T-minus 18 minutes. Once again, if you're just joining us, you're looking live at Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is getting ready to launch a batch of 54 Starlink satellites. Liftoff is scheduled for 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time. This will be the second launch attempt for this Falcon 9 rocket. The first attempt on Thursday night, Friday morning, was aborted in the final minute of the countdown due to an unspecified problem. Earlier today at 12:50 a.m., SpaceX fired the engines on this rocket while they held it down on the launch pad for a static test fire. Whatever problems they were working, they obviously resolved, as today's countdown is now proceeding, nearing the end of this vent, and the start of liquid oxygen loading aboard the second stage will get underway shortly.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And there we have confirmation from the launch team that the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage of the rocket is now underway. So at this point, liquid oxygen is being loaded on both the first and second stage. The second stage kerosene tank is full, and loading of kerosene is continuing on the first stage. So SpaceX is pushing the envelope again this week. This will be the second time in 1 week that a Falcon 9 rocket has flown for a 16th time. Previously, SpaceX had certified the Falcon 9 booster for 15 missions. It's now extending that out. We presume to the next increment of 20 flights per booster. Let's take a look at the flight history of booster 1060. So this booster first flew in June 2020, carrying a global positioning system satellite into orbit. Its next flight was in September of that year, when it launched 60 Starlink satellites. It carried another 60 Starlinks into orbit in October 2020. In January of 2021, it launched the Turksat 5A communication satellite. It returned to a run of Starlink missions, launching 3 batches of 60 Starlink satellites, the first version of the Starlink satellite constellation. It then flew the second transporter mission. This is SpaceX's rideshare program, where it fills the Falcon 9 fairing with a variety of payloads that have paid their way based on their mass. Multiple satellites launched on that Transporter 2 mission. It returned to Starlink launches, launching 48 satellites on the Starlink 4-3 mission, and then 49 more in January of 2022. 47 Starlink satellites on the next mission, followed by 2 batches of 53 Starlink satellites. It then launched the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites for Intelsat. It returned to its transporter duties with the Transporter 6 mission earlier this year in January. And now it's getting ready to launch the Starlink 5-15 mission, its 16th flight. Now less than 12 minutes before the launch of the Falcon 9. T-minus 10 minutes and counting. After launching from Cape Canaveral, the Falcon 9 will head southeast. It's on a trajectory to place the Starlink satellites into a 43-degree inclination orbit. The first stage booster will land on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. This is the latest drone ship to enter SpaceX's fleet. It went into service in 2021. The company operates 3 drone ships in total. Each ship is about the size of a football field. It's a converted ocean-going barge, and SpaceX has named the drone ships after spacecraft that were featured in the science fiction series Culture, which was written by Ian Banks. That drone ship is stationed in the Atlantic Ocean, just east of the Bahamas. That's about 400 miles downrange from Cape Canaveral. We're coming up on the process known as engine chill.
Engine chill has started.
They're the launch team confirming that the engine chill process is underway. A small amount of liquid oxygen is being run through the engine's plumbing, through the turbo pumps, to cool down all of that metal work so that when the ignition sequence happens and liquid oxygen flows through, it does not cause a thermal shock and damage any of those crucial systems in the engine. T-minus
Stage
6
1
minutes.
RP1 load is complete.
And we've had confirmation that the loading of kerosene aboard the first stage is now complete. So the loading of liquid oxygen continues on the first and second stages. T-minus 5 minutes and counting. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like button on our stream. That really helps us out. And if you'd like to support our coverage further, please consider making a donation through the super chat.
For Stromback retract.
We're coming up on the retraction of the strongback structure. SpaceX has said that the scrub on Thursday night, Friday morning was caused by elevated oxygen levels in one of the engines. They were able to resolve that problem and verify all was working correctly with the static test fire that happened overnight. So with the retraction of the strongback, the clamps at the top of that structure have opened up and the hydraulic systems are backing it away from the vehicle. You can see now the gap has opened up between the Falcon 9 and the strongback structure. It's retracting to a distance of, or an angle of about 1.5 degrees. At launch, that strongback will pull further away from the vehicle. Coming up on 3 minutes.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
And we've heard that loading of liquid oxygen aboard the first stage is now complete. At this point, the rocket's autonomous destruct system is being armed. We're nearing completion of liquid oxygen loading on the second stage. Less than 2 minutes to launch.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And confirmation that loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage is now complete. The venting you're seeing is some purges of the strongback structure.
Ground gas closeouts.
Those are the ground gas closeouts that we just heard the launch team refer to. Coming up on 1 minute. At 1 minute, the computers aboard the Falcon 9 will take control of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
There's confirmation that the Falcon 9's onboard computers have taken control of the countdown. Waiting. And the launch director has given his go for launch. "15 seconds. Watch out for the green flash of ignition. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 carrying 54 Starlink satellites into orbit. The Falcon 9 has cleared the tower. The roar of the Falcon 9 engines will reach us shortly. Falcon 9 is pitching downrange. Incredible roar from the Falcon 9. Trajectory is nominal. It's approaching the point of maximum dynamic pressure. Now traveling faster than the speed of sound. See the Falcon 9 painting a plume in the sky. It has passed through the period of maximum dynamic pressure. Chill down of the upper stage engine is underway. We're approaching main engine cutoff, or MECO. The Merlin engines will shut down, and that will be followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage. And that will be closely followed by the jettison of the payload fairing. There we've had shutdown of the first stage.
Main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
Separation, we can now see separation of the
MVAC
first stage in these images coming from SpaceX. They come to us with a little bit of a delay. So we saw the actual main engine cutoff in our own camera footage some 10 seconds before. There's separation of the fairing. You can now see the Starlink satellites on the right side of your screen. On the left side of your screen, the titanium grid fins on the first stage are extending. The second stage, Merlin engine, the vacuum engine is glowing red hot as it propels the Starlink satellites towards orbit, now approaching 9,000 kilometers in velocity and an altitude of 107 kilometers. Meanwhile, the first stage, the altitude that you can see in the meter on the left side of your screen is still climbing. We are still getting views of the second stage from our camera here at the Kennedy Space Center press site. So the first stage is continuing to arc upwards, heading towards a landing on the drone ship east of the Bahamas, while the second stage is continuing on its path to orbit. You see there the Merlin vacuum engine firing away, now reached a velocity of over 10,000 kilometers per hour, an altitude of 135 kilometers. Meanwhile, the first stage, the velocity is starting to build as it will begin to lose altitude very soon. They're starting to lose altitude. It's reached its peak. The top of the arc as it starts to head towards the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. That's the third drone ship in SpaceX's fleet. We're coming up on the entry burn. That burn is required to slow the Falcon 9 first stage as it falls back through the atmosphere to prevent it overheating as it hits the denser portion of the atmosphere. You can see the speed continuing to build as it falls out of the sky like a dart. Altitude now under 80 kilometers. Look out for the entry burn on the left side of your screen. And there it looks like we've had ignition of for the entry burn. This is a burn of 3 of the Merlin engines. And watch that speed gauge on the left. The rocket is slamming on the brakes, and you can see the velocity slowing dramatically. That entry burn is now complete. The Falcon 9 first stage, you can see in this tracking map, is closing in on the location of the drone ship east of the Bahamas. The second stage continues on its path to orbit. Now 7 minutes into flight. The second stage is approaching 18,000 kilometers per hour in velocity. Meanwhile, the first stage is continuing its descent, now less than 12 kilometers in altitude. And we just heard the first stage is slow below the speed of sound, 8 kilometers in altitude. Landing bird will be coming up next. A single Merlin engine will fire for that burn, and the landing legs should deploy right before touchdown. That's less than 30 seconds away. The view, there's the landing burn ignition. You can see those titanium grid fins turning to help steer the rocket. I think we can just make out the drone ship below now. And touchdown. Booster 1060 has successfully landed on the drone ship, its 16th mission. Coming up on second engine cutoff.
MVAC shutdown.
And there we have the shutdown of that MVAC engine on the second stage of the Falcon 9. It's now going into a coast.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
So SpaceX is concluding its webcast, so we won't be receiving any more video from the rocket's second stage.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
now 10 minutes since launch. So the Falcon 9 is in a coast phase that lasts about 45 minutes in total. At the end of this coast, the second stage engine will ignite for a few seconds to finalize the orbit of the Starlink satellites. The Falcon 9 is targeting an orbit with an apogee or high point of 211 miles, that's 339 kilometers, and a perigee, the low point, of 186 miles or 299 kilometers. The orbit will be inclined at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. Separation of the Starlink satellites will come approximately an hour and 5 minutes into flight. So with the Falcon 9 second stage in this long coast phase, we're going to end tonight's webcast. We will continue to bring you updates on the progress of the mission in our Launchpad live stream, and we'll post the link to that stream in the chat. You should also be redirected to that stream. There's about another 50 minutes or so before the deployment of the 54 Starlink satellites. So we'd like to thank everyone who's contributed through the Super Chat feature or by hitting the like button or becoming a member of our YouTube channel. It really helps us out and enables us to provide this live coverage from Cape Canaveral. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Will Robinson-Smith, who's been manning the social media station tonight, and keeping everyone informed on Twitter of the progress of the mission, and also Adam Bernstein, who operated our camera and tracked the rocket tonight as it headed out of the spaceport on its way into orbit. So the next major launch from Cape Canaveral, we believe, will be the launch of the Falcon Heavy. There's a view of Launch Complex 39A where the Falcon Heavy will fly later this month. There is a very slight possibility that SpaceX could squeeze in an additional Starlink mission, but now it seems like the Falcon Heavy is probably our next launch from the Space Coast. So we thank you for joining us tonight. Tune in to our Launchpad Live channel for our coverage of the deployment of the Starlink satellites. So this is Stephen Young reporting from Cape Canaveral. I wish you a very good night.